What we want to give kids is a story that they can live inside of, to have them feel excited about their role as American citizens.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Talking About Kids is kicking off our 4th season with a very special guest, Kitty Felde. Kitty is a veteran public radio journalist who has won multiple awards for her coverage of Capitol Hill. Kitty's desire to expose kids to the genuine Capitol Hill and the real workings of government led her down an unconventional path, that of writing mysteries. Kitty discusses her Fina Mendoza book series next. This episode is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. Talking About Kids is designed to help parents, teachers, and other professionals help kids. If you enjoy this episode, please give it a positive review and share it with your friends and colleagues. And now, the interview.
I actually used to explain things about Capitol Hill and government to grown-ups, and that's what I did for 10 years on Capitol Hill as a public radio journalist. But I kept seeing all these 8th graders wearing these matching T-shirts. These were kids that mostly from the area around what they call the DMV, or around DC, Maryland, Virginia, and all the surrounding states, Delaware. Kids would come in their 8th grade spring and show up in the U.S. Capitol to get their tour of Washington, D.C. But growing up in Southern California, I didn't get that tour. And
Right.
everybody I asked who I went to school with, they didn't get that tour. It was just too expensive and too cumbersome to go 3,000 miles away with a bus full of kids. So this was sort of my way of taking kids with me to Washington, D.C. and giving them that experience without the plane ride. And the larger thing that I wanted to do was to really try to connect kids to their federal government, because there really isn't any
Mm.
connection. Even in California, a lot of kids have never been to Sacramento to see the Capitol there. So, and I think that was probably bred in me by my mother, God rest her soul. But she was insistent that we become active in our community. And that could include writing a letter to the editor. I can remember the first time I had something published in the local paper. I felt like, oh my God, I'm a real writer. Or, she used to make us go to grocery stores and hand out flyers to support the United Farm Workers Union in their boycott of grapes. I mean, I never ate grapes my entire life till I was an adult. Or even, presidential campaigns. She'd have us knocking on doors asking people to vote for certain candidates for president. So, I mean, it was bred in my blood. And looking back, it's made me feel like I have a connection to government. And that's what I want kids to feel. It's not far away. It's not run, by a bunch of mysterious people doing
Right.
things just to make you mad. This is our government, and it's our job to become a part of the experience. So that's how come.
Well, I've got questions about that, Kitty, because, you, especially given your background, you could have gone about writing a series that was, more like Civics, right? And instead, you've created the Fina Mendoza series. I never know how much to talk about books that the listeners have not read yet, but they are about a young girl named Fina Mendoza, and instead of it being like I said, a civics lesson, these are kind of mysteries, aren't they? How do
Well,
you describe the Fina Mendoza series?
I describe it, I think you've done a pretty good job, but they really are. They're a family story. They're a
Hmm.
mystery about the 10-year-old daughter of a congressman from Southern California The family moves to Washington, D.C., and we're seeing it through her eyes. And she stumbles upon her first mystery, which is this mysterious cat, which allegedly is the demon cat of Capitol Hill, a
Hmm.
story that goes around every year around Halloween about how the US Capitol is haunted by a demon cat and you are cursed with bad luck for the rest of your life. And because Fina's family has already experienced a lot of bad luck, the kids lost their mom, the father lost his wife, and it didn't happen immediately before the book started, but it happened recently enough that the kids are still carrying that around with them. And so she doesn't need any more bad luck. Here's why I felt like Fina was the perfect way to do this, because we love stories.
Mm.
I love stories. I love characters. I love to be able to fall in love with characters and spend some time with them. I hate facts and figures. And my assistant and I were talking yesterday about a teacher's guide, and she had some suggestions to include that included dates and places and three branches of government. And I thought, no, 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 no. They can get that someplace else. What we want to give kids is a story that they can live inside of and get it to have them feel excited about their role as
Mm.
American citizens or wannabe American citizens.
Well, that brings me to this next question because, as I was reading it, I know enough about Washington, D.C. to be just a little bit dangerous, having only lived there, a few months. And so there were things that I recognized as absolutely true, absolutely factual, and that was clearly written by somebody that knew the city. But then that made me question other things. For example, and again, I not giving too much away, but the book, the first in the series, Welcome to Washington, Fina Mendoza. She is in, if I'm not mistaken, a basement in Capitol Hill, and she is looking at a model of the National Mall,
Yep.
and she's by a statue of Caesar Rodney. All of that is real, correct? Those are all
Yes.
actual things that exist. So this legend of the demon cat, is that also a Capitol Hill legend, or is that
Yes.
pure kitty?
Oh,
Okay.
yes. No, no, no. That is if you go to Washington, D.C. and you pick up the paper, local paper, or the Hill Rag or any of the local papers around Halloween, you will see that story retold again and again and again. And the more that I did research on it, people were trying to explain where did this legend come from. The
Mm,
stories were great. So all of those explanations that show up in the book are actually based in fact. I went through old newspaper archives looking for some of the stories, like the one about the Capitol policeman. Back in the day, Capitol Police were mostly relatives of people who were elected to office. And a
mhm.
lot of them were not very good police officers. And some of them drank a lot on the job. And this one particular officer decided to take a nap. And when he woke up, there was this face in his head, right in front of his face. There was this giant head in front of his face. And it was a cat. And, he thought, oh my goodness, it's just like the biggest cat on planet Earth. Well, it was just because it was in front of his face and he was
Right.
drunk. But he got the day off. And
Mm,
suddenly everybody else started seeing this cat to get the day off, you see? So the story grows and grows and grows. So, yeah, things are based in fact. And in fact,
mm,
um, I decided we needed to have a newsletter that really pointed out what I call the facts behind the fiction, because there are so many wonderful little stories about the way our government works or about Washington, D.C. or the US Capitol that I wasn't able to explain or, give footnotes for in the book. But
mm,
that's why I do this newsletter and blog called Facts Behind the Fiction that explores things like, um, uh, what do they call it? What do they call it? They call it district work session, which Fina calls recess,
mm.
when all the members of Congress go back to their home
Right.
districts, and I explain, how does that work? All that. What are they really doing? Those kinds of things. So I think there's a room for sticking facts in a really wonderful setting that makes you want to know more, which makes you go to Google and look it up yourself, or you can go to our Facts Behind the Fiction pages.
And correct me if I'm wrong, though, but I sense kind of a second agenda at place here. So not only getting young people interested in the workings of government and the workings, in particularly of Capitol Hill, but and you're explicit in this in some of your material, so I'm not giving too much away. that you're
No, not at
also
all.
wanting to humanize the people doing this work. So, why do you think it's
Definitely.
important for young people to see the people working on Capitol Hill as real people with families and personalities and real people concerns?
Well, I think it's very easy for us to demonize each other. If somebody doesn't agree with us, we can lash out on social. We don't have any of those kinds of people as friends. We
Mhm.
don't see them as fellow human beings, and this is a problem on Capitol Hill as well. And everybody talks about how can you fix it, because in the old days, members of Congress used to live in D.C. with their families because before the days of jet travel, it took forever to get back to
Yeah.
your district. And if you're currently a member of Congress from someplace like Alaska, it takes forever to get back to your district, which is what most people do. And when people lived in DC with their families, they would show up at soccer games, at the grocery store, they would go to the
Yeah.
same church. They would know each other off the field, if we can use a sports analogy there. Today, members of Congress fly into Washington on Monday night. They cast one simple vote, which is usually, the naming of a post office, and they fly out on Thursday afternoon. And I think it's
Yeah.
in this first book where Fina's out in the plaza where all the black SUVs are parked with their motors running, ready to take the member of Congress, whisk them off to DCA, the national airport, Reagan National Airport, so they can go home for the weekend. So they don't see each other except in the halls of Congress. And as a general rule, they hang out with their own party. A lot of people are punished for talking to somebody from the other party. So there's
Yeah.
no immediate connection with them other than being the other. And I feel that we have adopted that because we pay attention to the social media that seems to support our own points of view. That's how the algorithm works. We watch the news on the stations that we think reflect our
Sure.
own points of view. So we don't have that experience of interacting with people on a social level. And that's the whole point of that is I really want kids to not see these people as heads on TV, somebody from the other party that my mom hates. I want to see them as human beings who are there to try to do something good, because I
Yeah.
intrinsically believe, and I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this, but I think people run for Congress because they want to make a difference. They
Yeah.
want to change something that they see is wrong. Things may happen along the way, corruption definitely happens, but at the core, they're human beings. And I think it's important to see them that way because then we can see ourselves in that position as well.
Well, and you've got me thinking about my time in DC. So I got to right after undergrad, before starting graduate school, I got to work for a summer
How
because of the
lucky we would.
scholarship. Yeah,
Wow.
totally right. And I was not a California kid, but I was an Arizona boy. So no, I had not had the time on Capitol Hill like that. All of my friends were staffers. I wasn't. I was working in health and human services because I was
Very
working on kid
important work.
issues. Right. But my friends were staffers, and they were staffers for people on both sides of the aisle,
Mm,
and they would argue about policy,
mm,
but not about the people's character, right? They wouldn't argue about they they. I remember them thinking that all of these people were terribly impressive, but they just
yeah,
happen to have different policy agendas and different policy ideas, but they weren't
yeah.
demonized. And I don't remember anybody being told that they couldn't hang out with staffers from across the aisle. So it is too bad.
It is too bad. I mean, well, and if you're a staffer for a Democrat, I think I can only think of one instance where that person got a job working for a Republican.
Mm.
That's if you work for, you gotta pick your side, that's sort of the rule. So
Yeah.
that's unfortunate, but it's kinda the way it is right now.
You also made some choices about, the family of Fina, which I think are interesting. Why did you choose to create that family structure for Fina?
I this is one of those tough questions. Why did you write a Latina main character when you're in your blood, you're not Latina? I grew up in Compton, California, and I lived there
Mm.
until the mid 70s when I went to college. And I just gave my age away, but oh well. And then, but I grew up in a multicultural family. My folks adopted kids. So my siblings, let's see, we've got half Filipino, half Armenian, Latino, and German. Native American, and something else. You know what I mean? So there's sort of a
Right.
polyglot families where I grew up with, and my neighborhood was also multicultural. I was there. So I grew up, and in Southern California itself is pretty darn multicultural, even more so now than it was when I was growing up. So I wanted, and because so many of the members of Congress I met from Southern California, because that was my job, were Latino. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? I was surrounded by, I met their families. I got to be around them a lot. And I just knew that I wanted more kids to think about running for Congress, that it's not just a bunch of old white men. That combined
Right.
with, I had mentored a kid years ago. It was this program that would match you up with a kid in high school, and you'd work with them until they got to college. You really would, they were first generation kids going to college. And her name was Fina. And, I've stayed in touch with her all these years. And when I was writing the book, I never knew her when she was 10, but I could imagine her when I was 10. And so I
Mm.
had asked her if I could borrow her name, and she gave me her blessings. And God love her, she is in line for a principal's job now. She's been teaching for a number of years. So, the potential is there. My little Fina, she's going to conquer the world. And
Right.
here I see evidence of it too.
So, in addition to understanding the kind of what sort of things happen on Capitol Hill, you mentioned that you didn't want it to be, you didn't want to have the explicit lessons about the three branches of government and how they work together. Where do you hope kids then go next?
Well, I think that what I want them to think is, what can I do? And that is where a lot of the
Mm.
supplemental materials that I've created go in conjunction with a school librarian who's been writing the teacher's guides. There are exercises and things one can do. When I go do an author visit, I do a mini civics lesson. Kids don't know that, but we start with a big map of the United States, and I have the kids try to find Washington on the map. And of course, they always point to the state above Oregon,
Mm.
because it's also Washington. And we end by having them write a postcard to members of Congress, because we talk about, how does a law get made? Where do those ideas come from? They come from you. The overall thing I want kids to take away is an interest in Washington, D.C., perhaps a curiosity about wanting to visit, asking questions of their parents and teachers and other adults about things that they find interesting and curious, but also to feel that they have a role, that there's something they can do, that
Mm.
this is their government. It isn't just for people over the age of 18 who can vote. And hopefully this will carry them through so that when they are 18, they will vote.
Thinking about your own experience, like where did how did these stories what path did they lead you on? Did you go from because like you, I think, I loved all the stories that people had. If you were around anybody that had spent any amount of time in Washington, D.C., they could be walking down the street and they could point at a building and they could point at, an entranceway and they can say, so and so is walking down this street and they were talking with so. And for me, that was fascinating.
Yeah.
In your journey, how did these anecdotes and these little stories? Where did you go next? Was it deeper into biographies? Was it?
It's everything. And I was even curious about this stuff when I was living in DC and reporting. There were
Mm.
so many weird things to me.
Yeah.
That fish out of water trope. That's what I was. That's what Fina is. So she's looking at Washington from an outsider's point of view and noticing things that seem odd or weird to her. And
Mm.
one thing that struck me as weird when I was there was the way people dressed. I mean, they didn't dress like Californians. I brought a pair of absolutely gorgeous lime green mules with me to Washington, and people looked at me like I was out of my mind, partially because, and I had a little kitten heel. It was so cute. But, the streets are either cobblestone or brick
Right.
or marble, and they're hard to walk on. And when I was there, people wearing just, I think, the ugliest shoes in America. And they so offended me. I started taking pictures and posting them on its own Twitter account. In those days, it was Twitter, called Shoes on the Hill. And, members of Congress and reporters and anybody walking by, they all had just hideous shoes. So that was my way then of getting those
Right.
stories out. And then, when I came back to California to visit, and since I've moved back home, you start telling these stories about interesting, weird little things. And people just aren't, after I ran out of people to tell those stories to, I stuck them in the Fina
Right.
stories because it was a new way to try to tell these things that I found were so weird. But when I'm doing research, It's a lot of different things. So, one of my best email buddies is the house historian, always asking questions there, or the architect of the Capitol. I go back to Washington twice a year just to kind of refresh my memory for some of the
Mhm.
sense oriented things. I mean, cherry blossoms don't smell.
Mhm.
I could forgot about that.
Right.
Those kinds of things to keep it real and to keep it current. Also, I know people who are still working on the Hill, and they'll tell me stories, and I religiously read a lot of the local political papers just because I like to see what's new and what's going on. I keep in touch with a lot of members of Congress. So, I try to keep those sources fresh. And it's so interesting right now, Brad, because I'm working on the third book, which is, no, excuse me, the fourth book, which is set back in Los Angeles in the summer when the congressman is running for reelection
Mm.
and he brings all the family back home. But, I set this is one of the dumb things you do as a writer. I set it in a neighborhood that I wasn't that familiar with. I wanted it to be in the 34th congressional district, and I generally knew the area, but I just picked a street out of the atlas because I thought it was a cool sounding street where they live, Pagoda Place. Well, finally, I this summer I went up to actually visit Pagoda Place and to see what the neighborhood was like. And the book I'm working on now, they go to watch the fireworks on the 4th of July from this place called Flat Top Mountain, and it's literally the a hill that's flat. And it's just all those little things, the smell of the sage, the names of the trees.
Right.
There was a telephone pole there that had, for no particular reason, a stuffed bear climbing up this telephone pole with a baby bear on its back. I mean, those kinds of little details, they're gold. They go in the book. So it feels like you're doing research in all kinds of different ways, in person, online, and talking to experts.
When I'm in DC, I know as I'm walking down the street that there's amazing things happening in all these buildings around me, and I have no idea what it is. I don't even know how to get into some of the buildings. I don't know how you get invited in some of the buildings, and some of them aren't official buildings, right? Some of them are if you're walking by a government building because it has the bottle opener sign out in front of it there. But there's all these other buildings and they're mysterious and there's things that look old and there's things that look sacred that don't have signs. So there's all of these things are going on constantly there. In the city is
Yeah.
kind of a mystery. So do you explore that side of it? The outside of the Capitol building, all of those other little unique places.
The truth is no, because, Fina's only 10, so her
Right.
mobility is kinda limited. So, but we do get away from Capitol Hill once in a while. For example, in the 3rd book, which is coming out in the spring, it's called Snake in the Grass, and it's about the partisanship, that seems to be poisoning Washington, DC.
Mm.
A lot of that is based one of seen is at Gallaudet University, which is the university for the deaf, and that is also the practice field for Democrats for the annual congressional charity baseball game that is held at Nats Park.
Mm.
So, I get to which I love. I mean, they just had it this past week, and it's a great event. I mean, it's not only raises a lot of money, it's really fun to watch people not not being in their gray
Right.
suit,
Right.
they're running around the field being really bad baseball
Right.
players, far and by and large. So it's fun to just sort of be in that milieu to take people someplace else. Fina also has been to the Supreme Court because she's idolizes Sonia Sotomayor, who, by the way, loves the Fina books herself. I have this little pen pal thing going on with the
Oh my
justice,
goodness.
I know, I can't believe it. She writes back and, said very nice things because she's in charge of the iCivics
Okay.
program, which is something that Sandra Day O'Connor had started trying to get civics back into the classroom. And so she inherited the mantle when O'Connor
Yeah.
retired. So this is sort of in her wheelhouse. Yeah, so I don't really take the whole city on, but things just crop up as the plot takes me there.
Do we also I mean, again, I found the character of Fina's older sister very teeny, very much in the, like, keeping track of her maturity in the half years, right? I'm 15 and a
Yep,
half, right? And
yep.
so do you that character, how do you keep your how do you keep the mannerisms of teens current? Or are you just kind of tapping into what's universal about adolescent behavior?
Well, I think that the interesting thing about, Gabby in book 2, she's going crazy about she does in book 1 too, but she wants to drive, she's desperate to drive,
Mm.
which is I was as a California kid.
Mhm.
I could hardly wait until I could get my, learner's permit, and if I had moved to Washington, DC, and found out that it had to be another year before I could qualify for that learner's permit, it would have driven me
Yeah.
nuts. I think, quite frankly, Gabby is most like me of all the characters in the book, except maybe Abuelita, the grandmother. But, I don't gamble, but other than that, um, but Gabby, she's a little crabby. That's how they describe her all the time, and I think I identify with her. So I don't know that I worry too much about what current kids are doing or thinking or anything else. It's that character, and her voice is so clear. It's so easy to write for her. She just, put the pen down and she just, "Blah," you just try to keep up with her. And, we did a podcast version of the first 2 books, and it's available free called the Fina Mendoza Mysteries, and the actress who plays her, who, by the way, is now a teacher as well,
Mhm.
is wonderful, and I can't even write now when I'm writing the new books without hearing her voice in my head.
Right.
She really captures Gabby like crazy, and the girl who plays well, and both of them are fabulous. The one who plays Fina Mendoza, Amy Solano, is terrific. So, and Monica Vigil is Gabby, and they're fabulous. They just brought those characters to life.
Well, I wasn't aware of the podcast, so that's fantastic. I think that that's something that my listeners can use in addition to the book. It's probably even a wonderful way to get a whole class involved in different parts of these books for sure.
And one other way that people are using the podcast, is there are Spanish versions of the first 2 books out. The 3rd book comes out next year, and the Spanish version comes out, in the fall of next year. And a lot of people who are in bilingual schools will use the podcast to listen, and then the kid will
Mm,
read a chapter so that you have at least some sense of what you're looking for when you're trying to learn a language a different way. So, anyway, it's they all work together pretty darn well.
I have one last axe to grind, which
Oh,
is
boy.
yeah. So I have been I have an ongoing problem with how people determine the reading level of a book.
Oh, yes.
And my guess is if we maybe you've done it, and maybe I'm wrong, but if we were to put your book through a calculator that only generated the Flesh Kincaid rating scale, my guess is that it appears to be older than your target demographic.
It depends, as
Okay.
you say. It depends, as you say, on reading level. And here's the thing, we've done Lexile runs
Hmm.
on the language, and it lands right around 3rd to 5th grade.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's fine in the books, but I go into classrooms. I do a different podcast called the Book Club for Kids, where I go in and talk to kids. It's just like a book club, but we record it and it
Hmm.
goes on the air. And the reading levels are all over the board,
Hmm.
and particularly post-COVID, kids are way, way
Hmm.
behind. So I'm always concerned that, and I, quite frankly, made a mistake of making her a 4th grader. She should have been a 5th grader because that's when most schools introduce civics,
Mm.
like, duh. But when you're writing, characters just announce who they are and how old they are.
Yeah.
You oftentimes don't have a lot of control over that. So if I were smart, I would have made her a 5th grader. And but because I go into classrooms a lot, it's interesting to see where this lands with kids
Hmm.
as far as grade levels go. So there's a novella called, Losing is Democratic, and it's a way to talk to kids about January
Hmm.
6th. And a publicist told me, "Well, get some kids to review it." So I sent books out to 2 different schools, one in DC and one in LA, and I got the reviews back from the kids, and it was really interesting because the kids got it,
Yeah.
and I was worried because they were lower grades that they wouldn't be able to understand it. No, they got it right away. So I don't know what to say about that. I feel terrible because I grew up in a library
Right.
practically, and not to see kids reading for pleasure just breaks my heart.
Well, I only mention that because it to me it didn't seem like I've read, in both my professional life, but also in doing this podcast, I've read books that felt like they worked to bring language down to whatever level. And I know enough about psychology to know that that's actually not how you teach language. That something like a
Mm.
blunt tool of simply counting the letters in a word has really very little to do with meaning and comprehension, right? And so I was impressed that it didn't seem to me that you shied away from names or concepts or terms, that you presented them honestly. I think your sentence structure is spot on for the age of your readers, but you didn't shy away from things, and I appreciate that. I didn't know if you received any pushback on that, but it sounds like maybe you didn't.
No, not really, and a lot of, we also because the teacher's guides include
Mhm.
vocabulary, teachers are really, and here's the other thing, it isn't just normal language that we're using in the book. A lot of this is sort of inside Washington
Yeah,
language.
exactly.
So, yeah, so the whole thing is like, well, what do you do? How do you but I because we're looking at it through the eyes of a 10-year-old, it's easier. I've gotta explain these things the way that Fina would
Right,
explain them or the way you'd explain it to her. So in many ways, you can use the complicated terms or ideas, but have them interpreted by a 10-year-old.
right.
So that helps a lot.
Well, and I think that it also, I think pedagogically, when you create the curiosity,
Mm,
when you make it part of a mystery, when if it's appealing enough, kids will find out what it means. And you also provide enough context that a lot of these terms are things where they don't have to rush to a dictionary to keep going. They'll know from the
yeah.
context a little bit, and then I think it'll spark their interest. So, well, first of all, I this was a pleasure getting to talk to you today. This was wonderful, and I was so excited for the books. Thank you so much. I very much recommend them to people, and thank you for writing them. I think it's a wonderful approach to this topic.
Oh, Brad, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you about a topic that I love to talk about. But thank you for your appreciation of the books. My goal in life is to try to save American democracy. So this is my one little drop in the ocean that hopefully will, spark a tidal wave at some point on the other shore.
That was Kitty Felde. As Kitty mentioned, there are teacher's guides to the Fina Mendoza books, and Kitty herself is available for virtual and in person author visits, which she calls Civics 101. Links to the Fina Mendoza books, the teacher's guides, and booking information for Kitty are available at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you visit talkingaboutkids.com, please let me know what you think about the podcast. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.